So, hello and welcome to this VetLit podcast. VetLit Minis are Journal Club podcasts on a range of topics, small animal focused, so you can keep up to date even if you just have a few minutes spare. My name is Abbe Crawford. I'm a veterinary neurologist, and today we're going to be learning all about Myasthenia Gravis. Joining us, we're very lucky to have Anne Vanhaesebrouck. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Anne is an associate teaching professor and a clinical neurologist at the University of Cambridge. She's undertaken a PhD at Oxford University, which focused on congenital myasthenia, and she's particularly interested in neuromuscular diseases and electrodiagnostics. So Anne's here today as the supervising author of a study entitled Case Series of Canine Myasthenia Gravis, a classification approach with consideration of seronegative dogs. So Anne, let's get started. And an important concept that we'll be addressing today is that not every dog with myasthenia gravis has antibodies to the acetylcholine receptor. I think what might be a really good starting point is if you would be happy to perhaps just give everybody a quick reminder about what myasthenia gravis is, perhaps some of the main causes and the clinical signs that we can see.
Yeah, hi Abby. So it's a disease of the neuromuscular junction, and it's specifically the autoantibody form. So there are two forms of myasthenia, the congenital form and then myasthenia gravis, which is the autoimmune form. So this article was based on the autoimmune form, where antibodies kind of attack the neuromuscular junction. So usually this is against the acetylcholine receptor, but we know from humans this could be also other receptors that are involved at the neuromuscular junction, so like MuSK or LRP4, for example. The most classical sign is probably the muscle fatigability. So an animal or dog, usually, they are most commonly affected. They can walk and then they kind of, after time, often a couple of meters, they start to sit down and lie down. You rest them and they can walk again. So it's a very muscle fatigability increasing with exercise and improving with rest. That's really characteristic. Some of the myasthenia gravis dogs are more difficult to diagnose because some of them are the focal form and they might have just megaesophagus alone. Sometimes they have reduced palpebral reflex, always important to check. Yeah, so that's for the focal form. Some dogs might have thymoma. And then you have the fourth form that we describe here more. So these seronegative dogs are dogs where the acetylcholine receptor antibody test, that's the final diagnostic test in dogs we have at the moment, doesn't confirm at this moment the diagnosis. We have quite a big seronegative, a big proportion of dogs are seronegative in this study, much more than originally reported. So we have around 22% of dogs that had classical signs of myasthenia gravis that did respond to pyridostigmine or had at least a decrement on the repetitive nerve stimulation. So they were very suggestive of myasthenia gravis and still they didn't have a positive acetylcholine receptor test. So in some of these dogs we repeated the test and they became later positive. But I think there's definitely a proportion of dogs that remains negative on the test and maybe more than we expected in the past. This could be different reasons. One of the reasons could be that another test would be needed, like in humans. I have now the cell-based assays, which are more sensitive in humans. We don't know in dogs because we don't have these tests at the moment. There could be also other antigens like MuSK or like before. These antigens are also around the neuromuscular junction, are important for clustering of the acetylcholine receptor at the neuromuscular junction. So there are plenty of reasons, maybe cortisone that has been administered before, although that's questionable. You probably have to have a long time of cortisone and for a high dose, but we don't know at the moment. So there are many different reasons. Also, there's still the possibility in some cases that a disease really mimics myasthenia gravis. And I think this group is really, at the moment we call them seronegative. I think there's a need to do further testing and figure out what they exactly are, prove it, but at the moment we can't. And also maybe to reiterate at this moment, the acetylcholine receptor via test is really a very good test. We should definitely do them. It's a very sensitive test, although we sometimes have seronegative dogs. It's a very well developed test.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, so I think I really agree. My experiences with myasthenia are honestly when I'm suspicious of it, my heart sinks because for me clinically it's been a really challenging disease to manage and my personal experiences have not been positive. And I've definitely encountered cases where I'm absolutely convinced they're myasthenic based on their clinical presentation and then their response to treatment, but their acetylcholine receptor antibody titer has come back negative. And yeah, so I guess the question is then, will they ultimately become positive if I retested weeks or months down the line, which I've rarely had the opportunity to do? Or is it, in fact, these dogs don't have these antibodies and there's either another antibody driving the disease or other aspects of the disease that we're not aware of?
Yeah, no, I think both are possible. I think we don't know that well from dogs. There are a couple of studies where it was repeated. And from our study, at least, we tested 10 dogs because it's not always done because some dogs do well. And so people don't do it then because it's doing already well. Or some dogs died. For example, in 10 dogs, it was repeated, and 2 of the 10 dogs, they developed within 1 or 2 months a higher titer. And it's also something which is an experience which is kind of shared in an article. But in humans, we know that it can even take up to 9 years to become positive. But it's also possible that indeed it's another autoantibody. So in humans, I think most of them, if the RIA test is negative, most of them will be detected with another test. Again, the acetylcholine receptor antibody will be detected with another test. And then if it's still negative, then quite a big proportion will be MuSK antibodies. And then a very tiny proportion will be LRP4 antibodies.
And just for anyone that hasn't had a chance to read the paper yet, Anne and her colleagues have collated data retrospectively from 167 dogs with myasthenia gravis across 3 different referral hospitals. And of those 167, 22 were seronegative. And by seronegative, we mean that they were negative for the acetylcholine receptor antibody on the RIA, radioimmunoassay standard test. Okay, so maybe Anne, if you wouldn't be able to chat us through some of the major findings of your study.
Yeah, I think the major findings, so one of them we mentioned is that the seronegative group was a bit bigger than initially thought, I think, because in the past people thought maybe it's only 2%. So now we think it's maybe higher, at least in our population. It might be different from country to country, but in our population, which is mainly England and Belgium. The other things we saw is that the seronegative groups were a bit younger and maybe less severely affected. They had less megaesophagus, which is a bit similar to humans, although articles might vary, but the big tendency is that they are a bit younger. The thymoma dogs were older, which is to be expected, I think. Again, this is similar to humans. The survival, the seronegative dogs generally did a bit better than the other 4 groups and the thymoma a bit worse. But what really comes out is dogs that do not develop megaesophagus, they have a much better outcome. And there must be a state of irreversibility, perhaps, that at one moment the megaesophagus can't return to normal, I think. I don't know, these are all hypotheses, and this is just my personal thinking.
Yeah, I agree. I think these are really interesting questions because exactly we see a patient that has generalized muscle weakness affecting all of its limbs, also has a megaesophagus. We treat it with pyridostigmine, an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, and we can really rapidly see an improvement in the muscle weakness, can't we? Like almost within hours, if not days, whereas we might actually never see resolution of the megaesophagus. So that's such an interesting question. What is it about the limb muscles that respond so well and the esophageal muscle that just that doesn't? And I think that's something that's really interesting and hopefully something that Anne will work on and shed light on in the future. So I guess another couple of findings that were really interesting were that you again are identifying megaesophagus in the vast majority of cases. I think you quote 84% of your dogs having megaesophagus in this study. So it's hugely important, isn't it? And then aspiration pneumonia in 55%. So I think, a really interesting finding for me is your percentage of the seronegative dogs. I remember studying for my neurology board exams and learning that 2% of dogs with myasthenia gravis are seronegative, and putting that down to them either having had lots of steroids recently testing too soon before they've had a chance to generate sufficient antibodies, or the opposite extreme, that they've got loads of antibodies, but they're all bound to their target.
Yeah.
That's exciting, isn't it? From a translational perspective, there's a lot that we can learn from what's being applied in people. And phase 1 will be teasing out these seronegative dogs and trying to decide, are there other antibody targets that could represent exciting means of understanding this disease, could allow us to develop new diagnostic tests, could allow us to develop new treatment strategies.
Yeah. And maybe in humans, I think like 5% seems to be misdiagnosis. So there could be percentage that is misdiagnosis. So we have to take that into account.
By misdiagnosis, you mean perhaps they've actually got a completely different disease. They
It could
just
be
appear.
congenital myasthenia, something that looks very similar.
Yeah. So where would you like to take your research next? What can you see developing from this study?
Yeah, I think what I think should be done is probably, there are several things. I think it would be nice, we clinically characterize these dogs now, but I think the next step is really like similar to humans, trying to figure out, do they have autoantibodies? Can we still detect them? It might not be the same as in humans. Maybe we can't, and maybe that's the only thing we find. Maybe there are other antigens than humans. I think at the moment, these are all questions we have. We really should think about the Myasthenia Gravis. Is there anything, maybe we can't treat it, but I think we haven't tried very hard. It's a very rare disease, and I feel it's not common, so you have to work with multiple centers together. But I think we probably need to think about a way how to improve it and how to maybe investigate esophagus, what's happening there, understand it better.
I think another interesting finding was your remission rate, because you comment that 18% of the dogs achieve long-term remission, so complete resolution of clinical signs, but that the mean time to achieve that is 712 days.
Yeah, I think it's 2 years or something. Yeah, I think that's approximately 2 years, and that has been reported before. Yeah, so it can take quite a long time, but to be honest, it's quite short compared to humans where it takes much longer.
Oh, really?
But the problem is that many dogs die and therefore can't go in remission the way how we calculate it, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you very much. One last little question is, obviously your study has very nicely segregated myasthenic dogs into 4 categories. So your generalized myasthenia gravis that have our acetylcholine receptor antibodies, focal myasthenia gravis that have the acetylcholine receptor antibodies, thymoma associated, and seronegative. If it was a human cohort, would each of those 4 groups be managed or treated differently, do you think?
Yes and no. I think, of course, for the thymoma, that would be different. I think they would probably remove the thymus because many humans will have thymic hyperplasia, which we in fact don't know in dogs. Maybe they do have to, but we have never investigated because you need CT in every dog, and we usually don't do that always because of the cost. It's quite expensive. But in humans, they have done studies where they took out in thymic hyperplasia, no thymoma, and they had better control. So I presume with thymoma, they would definitely take it out. So that's very different from the other groups. The focal myasthenia group, the Myasthenia group, humans don't have. They have a focal group, but that's ocular, so it's very different from ours. But the seronegative dogs and the generalized myasthenia gravis would be exactly treated the same. But what would be different is if you have a different autoantibody, like MuSK antibodies, you make them worse with pyridostigmine. They might land in ICU. You have to treat them with immunosuppression. So it's depending of autoantibody. But acetylcholine receptor antibodies are still the main one.
Well, thank you very much. It's really nice to hear your knowledge, learn about your study. I think it's very exciting that somebody with your expertise is working to answer some of these questions and try and improve our abilities to diagnose and treat this fairly horrid disease.
Thank you very much. I hope I was a bit interested.
It was very interesting.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. The aim of VetLit is to make veterinary literature both more accessible and accessed. And hopefully we've secured that in some small way today. Remember, you will almost definitely find an article to read that interests you on the vetlit.org site. Check back here, there, or via the email updates for more. And otherwise, have a great day. It's goodbye from Anne.
Goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.